What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to Celio's Network. Today I'm going to be looking at some statistics and prior tournament results, and also some survey results of a survey that I posted online, all talking about Dallas Regionals and what I think the meta is going to look like and what the community is saying they think the meta is going to look like. Before we get into this, shout out to PotownStore.com. You can get PTCGO codes on there and use code Celio for 5% off. And also flipsidegaming.com, you can use code Celio, all caps, for 10% off of your next order, $10 or more. So Dallas Regionals is coming up. I took a survey, like I said, but first we're going to look at prior tournament results. So Richmond, this was black and white unified mind, so of course we didn't have Cosmic Eclipse, and there wasn't the recent ban list update as well for Richmond, and it's going to be the same when we look at Portland. And so Richmond, Agral won this tournament. Turbo Dark got second. So something I want to talk about here is that Turbo Dark was very hyped up for this tournament. Turbo Dark was one of the tier 1 decks and one of the decks to beat, kind of. And so there was a lot of counters to Turbo Dark and a lot of archetypes that we're seeing play solely because of their good Turbo Dark matchup. So things like Buzzwole Gardevoir, things like Night March, things like Hitmonwob. And we see that a lot, especially, it's actually really easy to kind of see the trends between Richmond and Portland and then compare them back to things like Toronto of last season. And I talked about this a lot leading up to Richmond and Portland, just because the top deck was Fighting Week, and back in Toronto, the top deck was Pika Rom, and that was also Fighting type week. So Turbo Dark was the deck going in, and then we knew that there would be a lot of Turbo Dark counters to follow, which is why I thought Trev was a really good play, and I played Trev in it for this tournament. Where am I? Here I am. And I knew there was an X deck. Like, Trevenant was the play for Toronto last season in this same situation. And I knew it was one of the best plays, but I knew there was X deck ahead of it, and that ended up being Rowlet and Alone, Executor, Vileplume, Egg Route, Route Eggs, whatever you call it, that John Craywall or JW Craywall won Richmond with. So Turbo Dark was very beatable for Richmond. That's something to keep in mind. Now, moving into Portland, Turbo Dark was still the most popular deck, very hyped up. Some people got scared of Egg Route, so Weavile GX became a thing. Portland had a pretty weird meta, but what we're going to really focus on for Portland is that there were 94 dark boxes, or turbo darks, or whatever you want to call it, in day one. And you can see this from RK9 Labs. So there were 94 dark with Weavile GX in day one at Portland, and there were also other dark 10. So if you add that up, that's 104 darks in day one, and there were less than 500 players in Portland, so there was over a 20% meta share day one of just dark decks. And that was after people knew it was going to be countered by like Buzzwole and Hitmonwob and Night March and things like that, and it was still just played so much because it's a strong deck. People have the cards for it. It's not at the highest skill cap, so it's fairly easy to play compared to some other things. It's still a good deck. It's strong. It's appealing to play. And for Portland, there was a huge uptick in Gardevoir Sylveon. Drew Kate did get 4th in Richmond with Gardevoir Sylveon. But for Portland day one, Gardevoir Sylveon was actually the second most played deck. And I feel like these results are kind of going by the wayside. Not a lot of people realize that there was over 20% meta share day one in Portland of Turbo Dark. Like, that's unheard of for there to be 20+% of a single archetype in day one of a tournament. That's pretty wild. And then Gardevoir saw a lot of play, and I think that's because Gardevoir's cheap and people had it from standard. And Pika Rom saw a ton of play as well after having one day two spot. Oh no, two day two appearances in Richmond. Harris Dorn top 32, and then Steven Varesco in top 64. So Pikarom and Gardevoir Sylveon saw an insane amount of play in Portland. In my opinion, that's a crazy amount of play. And I think it's because people had the cards from Standard to play the decks, and they were already comfortable with the decks, and that has a lot to do with it. So that's something we need to keep in mind moving forward. I just wanted to review the most recent expanded decks, expanded tournaments, and the decks that were played there. So I took this survey, I posted it in Verbank Hayfonte 2 on my Twitter, and I had a few questions, 4 questions exactly, to ask anybody that wanted to help out and answer some questions. Now, of course, with these kind of surveys, you have to take into account not everybody's going to be honest. Some people make a joke of it and answer obviously like out there answers, but for the most part, people want to help out with the data, and so there's a certain level of error that you have to account for, but it's like that with any survey. So my first question on the survey was, select the 6 archetypes you believe will be the most popular in the Masters Division at Dallas Regional Championships 2020. So it gets messy when I ask for like a whole sliding scale and like rank these 30 archetypes from 1 to 30. Like there's at some point it just becomes like a moot point. Like what's the difference between the 22nd most popular and the 31st most popular? It's not really that helpful. So I wanted to ask what people thought the 6 most popular archetypes would be, because I feel like most people discussing the most popular archetypes for Dallas in competitive settings are all saying the same thing. So the percentage here on these numbers will show the percentage of people who responded with one of these, with this deck, in their top 6. So I didn't ask for it in order, just give me your top 6 most popular, and then the percentage next to that deck shows how many people put it in their top 6. Also, Ultra Necrozma CEC variants is not showing up as a deck in the column, but that's what the second row is. So 106 people responded. So Turbo Dark, number 1. 89.6% of the people that responded said Turbo Dark would be in the top 6 most popular. 77.4. Actually, next is Zoroark Garbodor. This isn't ascending in any order. So 80.2% of responses said Zoroark Garbodor would be in the top 6, and then 77.4% all agreed that Ultra Necrozma, Mewtwo and Mew, and Gardevoir would be in the top 6 most popular archetypes, and 46.2% agreed that Aggrowl. So if you wanted to put this in a certain order, the first most popular according to this survey would be Turbo Dark, the second would be Zoroark Garbodor, but barely by any margin between Zoroark Garbodor and then numbers 3, 4, and 5. So I would say that numbers 2 through 5 are all basically the same amount. So Zoroark Garbodor, Ultra Necrozma variants, Mewtwo and Mew tag team, and Gardevoir would be 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th most popular according to this survey, and then Aggrowl would be number 6. Behind Aggrowl, 46.2%, the next highest would be Sableye variants such as Sable Garb and Sable Dolls at 17%, but I don't think that'll reach top 6, and it looks like the respondents mostly didn't think that either. Moving on to the next question. Select the archetypes that you believe are in contention to be the best decks in format, and I limited this to 3. So you could select 3 archetypes that you believed were in contention to be the best decks in format for Dallas Regionals. Now, of course, this is where you see some things where it's like, maybe do the people responding to these surveys actually think this, or are they just like throwing in bullcrap answers? Number 1, 67.9% of respondents said that Turbo Dark is in contention for best deck in format. 46.2% said Mewtwo and Mew was in contention for best deck in format. 34.9% said Zoroark Garbodor. Let's see. 16% said Gardevoir. Surprisingly, only 11% said Ultra Necrozma. And I think if I posted this survey like 3 weeks ago, Ultra Necrozma would be so much different than it is right now. And I sometimes do post these surveys, like I'll ask the same survey a month before the tournament and then a week before the tournament, but this time I didn't do that. But I do think it would have been changed drastically if I asked this question a few weeks ago. And then after Ultra Necrozma, or actually tied with Ultra Necrozma, is Stall variants, unspecified. And then after that is Aggrowl. So if we wanted to look at the top 3 in contention for best deck in format, it would be Turbo Dark, Mewtwo and Mew, and Zoroark Garbodor. And then after that, Guardian, and then after that, Ultra and Stall variants. My next question was pretty simple. It was just a statement. Turbo Dark will see more play than its counters. And I asked true or false. And so 85.8% of respondents said this was true. Turbo Dark will be more popular than the decks countering it. And 14% said false. And we'll get into why I asked that question in just a moment. And lastly, select the archetypes that you predict will be in top 8 of the Masters division. And for this, respondents could select anywhere from 1 to 8 different archetypes. So if they thought top 8 would be all one archetype, you select just one archetype. If you thought there would be 8 different, you select 8. So 84% of respondents all agreed that Turbo Dark would be in top 8 of the Master division. And then there's actually a lot of variance here, and I think that's expected, because top 8 and popular and best deck in format, they're all very different questions. So 84% of respondents had Turbo Dark in their list of archetypes they thought would be in top 8. 58.5% have Zoroark Garbodor. 57.5% have Mewtwo and Mew. And like I said, 58 to 57, it's no difference really when you're dealing with 106 responses. 1% is not a big deal. So they're basically the same answer there. Guardian, 50%, right down the middle of respondents thought that Guardian could be in top 8. We had Ultra Necrozma at 30%, which I'm kind of surprised by this number, since we had such low hope for it in being best deck in format. And it was very high on popularity, though. And like I said, the public's opinion on Ultra Necrozma has been dwindling down. So I was kind of surprised that 1/3 of the respondents think that Ultra Necrozma will be in top 8. And then we have roughly 1/3 saying Shocklock will be in top 8. Roughly 1/3 saying Aggrowl will be in top 8. Or actually, that's closer to a quarter saying Aggrowl will be in top 8. And then we got things like Sableye, 20%. So 1 out of 5 respondents thought that Sableye variants would be in top 8. Okay, reasonable. Also 1 out of 5 saying Stall variants, unspecified. So some pretty cool data here collected by me and answered by the community. So if you want to read into this a little bit more, feel free. I think I paused at every spot if you wanted to like screenshot any of the data or anything like that. So this that I have right here on the screen now is from Toronto 2019, expanded. 43 Pika ROM. This was hyped up as the BDIF, the deck to end all decks. Like, either beat Pika ROM or play it kind of thing. And that's how people are treating Turbo Dark right now. So, interesting. Pika ROM 43. Behind it, 38 Archies, not a big difference. They were both basically tied for first in popularity. But Lucario GX 30, Hitmonchan 22, Night March 21, Buzzwole Garbodor 12, miscellaneous Buzzwole decks 8. If you add all of these, and Buzzwole Lycanroc 4 keeps going. If you add up all these decks that were played to counter Pika ROM, it's more than double the amount of actual Pika ROM decks that were there. And Pika ROM did horrible at Toronto. There was one in day 2, and it came in last place of day 2. Just because there was so much counter. There was the Night Marches, there was the Lucario, the Buzzwole Garbodor. And because of all those counters lose to Trevenant. Trevenant made top 4. Could have arguably went a little farther. But that's besides the point. So Trevenant, Will Jenkins, top forward with Trevenant, and there were a lot of Trevenant there, in day 2, because Trevenant's just feasted on these Pika ROM decks. I'm sorry, on the counters to the Pika ROM decks. Trevenant actually took a very hard loss to Pika ROM, but if the Trevenants that managed to avoid Pika ROM and hit the counters did very well. Now, talking about all of this Turbo Dark that we think we're going to see. Turbo Dark, BDIF, play it or beat it. I think we could see something like that, where there is so much. If you add up all of the counters to Turbo Dark, there's more counter than there actually is the actual meta deck. And so lastly, we're going to get into my current predictions. My current predictions are not anything crazy. I pretty much agree with the internet, with the community, with the surveys. For popularity, I think it's going to kind of be cut and dry like this as of now. We're still a week out from the tournament, or a little more than a week out from the tournament, but I think Turbo Dark is going to be the most popular archetype. And I think Ultra Necrozma will be number 2, and I think Guardian, Mewtwo, and Zorogarb will be around the same at 3, 4, and 5. I do think Guardian and Mewtwo have the chance to be more popular than Zorogarb, because people have Guardian and Mewtwo and Mew cards for standard. Guardian is a cheap deck, which is why I have it at 3 and not 4. And also, Guardian is relatively easier, usually easier to play in most players' eyes than Zorogarb and Mewtwo and Mew. Turbo Dark and Ultra Necrozma are pretty easy to play. And so what I think could potentially happen is, let's just throw a few different kinds of archetypes into miscellaneous Turbo Dark counters. So let's say we have Hitmonwall, we have Buzzwole Garbodor, and we have Lucario GX. Let's say they each take up 7% of the meta. We'll just, and then, or whatever you want to say, they each take up 5% of the meta, and then if you combine them together, they take up 15%, and Turbo Dark only takes up 12. Or so we could put these into first place, or Turbo Dark still takes up 20, but so does Dark counters. I think there could be a lot of Dark counters, like there was Pika Rum counters in Toronto, like we were talking about, and also, like in Richmond, there was a lot of Turbo Dark counters in Richmond just a couple months ago, but Richmond wasn't run by Arcanine Labs, so we don't have a day 1 meta share for that, unfortunately. So we just have to go off the day 2 stuff for Richmond. But yeah, I think this is what it could potentially look like. I do think players are trying to counter these decks. So like Ultra Necrozma, Mewtwo and Mew, and Zorogarb all rely on special energy. There's something to capitalize on there. Guardian mostly plays basic Pokemon, so like you could maybe cheese them with Pyroar or Vileplume BUS. But then Dark is the problem. Dark is gatekeeping things. It's a problem for like Sableye because of Guzzlord. They can just win in a few turns because Guzzlord takes an extra prize. It's a problem for Plume and Pyroar because they play a Weavile line. Now, whether they play a 1 Weavile or 2 Weavile, if they play a Rescue Stretcher, etc., those things can matter. If they play a Stealthy Hood to get through Vileplume BUS, but the generic Turbo Dark lists look like they're playing either 2-1 or 2-2 Weavile, and that stuff, the 2-2 Weavile is a huge issue for Pyroar and for Vileplume BUS. So that's where players are having a hard time countering this meta. And because of the Guzzlord, it's actually hard to counter Turbo Dark with single prize attackers. So, like I said, for Richmond, players played Buzzwole Garbodor, players used Night March, and then for Portland, players used Lucario GX, but it's hard currently to even guarantee those counters have a near auto win versus Turbo Dark, because Turbo Dark just seems to have so much up its sleeve right now. So I'm going to leave you guys with that. I will have a full meta discussion with guests very soon on the channel. If it's not up this weekend, I'll be recording it this weekend, and we'll have it up early next week for you guys. But I wanted to get this statistics version of forecasting the meta and just start the discussion going. So if you guys want to talk in the comments, or my messages are open if anybody wants to talk about this stuff and try to theory out what the meta may look like. But there are past events like Richmond and Portland and Toronto that we can look at to try to say what we think will happen and try to mold and look at past things, like I said, to kind of foretell what will happen in Dallas Regionals. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Be sure to check out PotownStore.com and FlipsideGaming.com. Subscribe to the channel if you like the content, and I'll see you next time here on Celio's Network.